Here are my top tips for capturing the best quality Canon Log 3 footage on your Canon R6 or R6 Mark II. Capturing C-Log 3 footage when you're first starting off can be very challenging and daunting, but I'm gonna try to make it as simple as I possibly can in this video. So I'm gonna share a few exposure tips, setting tips, and how to edit it properly in post-production. So with that, let's get started. Let's cover what settings you need to set up first. So obviously we need to make sure we're shooting in C-Log 3. So we're gonna open our menu systems and go to Canon Log. On the R6 Mark II, it is the 5th page of the red menu. With this enabled, we can only select C-Log 3 on the Mark II, but if you have the first Canon R6, you have C-Log 1 and 3, select C-Log 3. In this menu, you have a few options. Let's first talk about Live View. Live View sort of is like having a LUT on your C-Log footage that you can see on the back LCD screen. However, I find that it's not very accurate, especially to the way I edit in post-production. It is a good starting point and it can be helpful for someone getting started, but I wouldn't really rely on it on the long term, and I would actually recommend that you turn this off so that you get used to exposing using the other tips I'm going to share. Next, we can sort of adjust the picture profile here just a little bit. We have options for adding sharpness, saturation. The only thing I change here is actually adding sharpness at about 3 because I find it to be a little bit too soft. And adding sharpness in post is a very tax-heavy process on your editing, so I'd rather just do it in camera. But feel free to experiment and see the level of sharpness you like. Now for color space, we're going to set this to Cinema Gamut. This gives us the widest color range on this camera and allows us to manipulate colors the most in post-production. Now we're going to back up and we're going to look for lens correction, which in this case is on the next page. Here, the only thing we're going to turn off is actually peripheral illumination correction. When this is on, it essentially removes the vignette that your lens naturally has. However, in doing so, it's going to brighten up those parts of the image, creating more noise, which is something I don't want. So of course, feel free to make your own judgment call on this. I prefer just having less noise in the corner and having a little bit of vignetting. And finally, the last thing we're going to change in the settings is actually zebras. You can find zebras on this page, and you're going to see you have 2 values you can set. First up, we're going to set zebra 1 to 55%. And for zebra 2, we're going to set that to 95%. We're going to cover how to use these zebras properly later on in the video, but now you're all done with the settings, you can exit it and get started shooting. So how do we shoot and expose in C-Log 3? One of the most important things to consider when you're shooting C-Log footage is proper exposure. C-Log 3 is a log gamma curve, meaning it compresses its dynamic range on the image, which is why it looks low saturation and low contrast. This is done to preserve detail both in the highlights and in the shadows. However, C-Log 3 is better at retaining highlight detail than it is shadow detail, where it has the most noise. So what that means for us is that if we want the widest dynamic range and the cleanest image possible, we need to make sure we expose a little bit to the right. First, we shouldn't set our ISO below 800. This is the base ISO for C-Log 3. But this can pose a challenge if you're going to be shooting somewhere bright, such as outdoors, especially since you may already have set your shutter speed and aperture to capture the quality of image that you wanted, and now you really can't adjust the ISO. Now you're just staring at an overblown image and you're really not getting any detail. So what is the solution here? Well, one, you can crank the shutter, which I wouldn't recommend, but instead I actually use VNDs or variable ND filters. In these bright conditions, using ND allows you to sort of bring the exposure down to the level that you need for your shot. But how do we know what is perfect exposure on C-Log 3? This is where we finally get to use the zebras. If we are in a bright situation like the outdoors, I would recommend turning on zebra 2. So what are zebra 2 detecting? Anything above 95% IRE or brightness will be clipped. That is why we set our zebra pattern to 95% so we can see at what point the image is actually losing detail. So with this enabled, you're going to see a bunch of zebras on your image. Now simply increase the strength until those zebras slowly start to disappear. Once you have all of them disappear, then you know you've exposed the image to its brightest value without completely clipping the highlights. This is what's called exposing to the right. This allows us to capture the highest dynamic range possible while keeping the image pretty clean, especially in the shadows. But there are 3 things you need to consider when you do this. 1, if you're shooting something that is naturally bright, like the sun or a light in the scene, it's going to be covered in those zebra patterns no matter what you do. And if you do try to remove them by exposing for that light source, you're going to see that the rest of your image is completely underexposed. So in these cases, you're not actually going to worry about the zebras on that light source and instead expose for everything else. That source can clip. A good test for this is to actually just see, do your eyes hurt when you look at this light source? If it hurts your eyes to look at, then it's completely fine if it clips on your camera, because that is a very natural look and a natural phenomenon. Number 2, if you're in a high contrast situation and you try to preserve the highlights, you may see that you're crushing and losing a lot of detail in the shadows. In these cases, there is no right or wrong. Just know what's important for the shot that you need. Do you need the sky and those bright parts to be exposed, or do you need your subject to be properly exposed? I always try to prioritize exposing for my subject, which does sometimes mean I'm actually going to be clipping highlights, especially in those high contrast situations. And number 3, shooting in a low light situation is kind of different in C-Log 3. You can choose to expose to the right by raising your ISO, but if you do so, just know this simple trick. ISOs are cleanest on Canon cameras when you double them. So the only ISOs you should be using when using C-Log 3 are 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, and 12800. In these cases though, I actually don't like exposing to the right too much. If anything, I may aim to expose to a +1 stop on the light meter, but more often than not, I actually don't mind if the image is dark because that's how it was in real life. So I don't worry about exposing to the right in low light situations. But now, why did we set zebra pattern 1 if we're not going to use it? Let me cover how to use that one now. Zebra pattern 1 is set to 55% because that is used to expose for skin. So this is really mostly useful when you're exposing for a subject in your scene. So you're going to want to turn on zebra pattern 1 and you should see zebra patterns on the subject's face. You want the zebra patterns to appear on the bright side of the subject's face and not the shadow side. Once you see those zebra patterns covering that bright side, then you know you have proper exposure on that person and you can lock it in. Finally, let's talk working with C-Log 3 footage in post-production. So Canon actually has a correction LUT that you can download for their website for free. I'll link it in the description so you don't have to go hunting for it. This LUT is fantastic and I think it does 90% of the job when it comes to color grading and color correction because it adds all that saturation and contrast back into the image that looks really nice. However, since we're exposing to the right, this LUT often looks overexposed in those shots. This is not an issue, simply just correct it, change the whites, bring down the exposure, whatever you need to do to sort of bring down those highlights that we brought up in the camera. But this can get tedious and annoying for every single shot, so this is what I do instead. I actually bought this LUT pack from Todd Dominy, who is another great creator here on YouTube. You really should check out his stuff. He has these exposure correction LUTs for C-Log 3 that I thought were really useful, especially for the use case of exposing to the right. These exposure compensation LUTs basically automatically adjust for the exposure value that you need. So if I overexpose the image, which I tend to do when I expose to the right, I do a -2 stops drop from Todd Dominy's LUT pack and it looks perfect. This has been absolutely amazing for my workflow and something that I would recommend. If I could create these LUTs myself, I would have done them, but I did have to buy them, so feel free to do what you will. Bonus tip. If you shoot with an external monitor, you can actually import LUTs into them, and then you can have a preview of what the shot's gonna look like depending on the LUT that you apply. So I actually have Todd Dominy's LUT pack on my monitor, and I set that to -2, which allows me to expose to the right, but look at the final image at its proper contrast and saturation. This helps me expose a lot faster when I'm on set, and it gives me a good preview of what's gonna look like in the final outcome. Now, none of this is gonna matter if you don't know how to set proper shutter speed, aperture, or white balance on your camera. So to learn how to properly set those settings, check out this video here. If you have any other questions about capturing C-Log 3 footage, leave them in the comments section below. Thank you all for watching all the way until the end of this video. I really appreciate it. Keep shooting amazing footage, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.